Sumer's first kingship descended from heaven. That is not a fringe slogan. It is the opening line of the Sumerian king list, preserved in cuneiform and translated by the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. The first political order in the earliest historical tradition of southern Mesopotamia does not rise from a tribe, a village council, a battlefield, or a contract. It arrives vertically, from above. I have covered the language of sacred kingship in a previous piece, but I kept returning to this formulation because it is so plain, so early, and so difficult to treat as decorative once you start noticing how often the same logic repeats across texts, artifacts, and temple landscapes. The problem is not that ancient people spoke mythically, and of course they did. The problem is that in Mesopotamia, at the exact point where history begins to harden into records, lists, seals, archives, and institutional memory, the official vocabulary of origin still insists that rule itself came down from the sky. If that sentence appeared once, I would file it where responsible historians usually file such things: cosmological language, royal ideology, the poetics of power. But it does not appear once. It echoes through Eridu, through flood traditions, through the Apkallu literature, through First Sage narratives, through later Babylonian recollections preserved by Berossus, and through a small cylinder seal in Berlin that has spent decades being treated either as proof of everything or evidence of nothing. I find both reactions inadequate. One is credulous, the other is incurious. And somewhere between them sits a real object, a real museum number, and a real pattern in the documentary record that will, at minimum, demands a better question than the ones usually asked. The ground here is not dubious ground. It is among the most studied landscapes in human history. The Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the British Museum in London, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Morgan Library, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures in Chicago, Oxford's, and the Electronic Babylonian Library at LMU Munich all sit inside the scholarly infrastructure of this subject. Anton Mortgat published the Berlin Seal Collection in 1940 in Vorderasiatischer Rollsiegel. Henry Frankfurt analysed Sargnid seals in 1934. Dominique Collon catalogued Akkadian and later cylinder seals for the British Museum. Joan Oates, Seton Lloyd, Fuad Safar, Mario Liverani, Piotr Mikolovsky, Jeremy Black, and many others built the standard map of early Mesopotamian civilization that any serious discussion still depends on. This is not a zone outside scholarship. It is scholarship at its most foundational. Eridu itself has been central for over a century and a half. John George Taylor visited Tel Abu Shahrain in the 1850s. Reginald Campbell Thompson returned in 1918. Harry R. H. Hall followed in 1919. The major Iraqi excavations under Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd began in 1946 and exposed the extraordinary temple sequence of Enki, the god of wisdom and subterranean waters. National Geographic's recent synthesis, drawing on that excavation history, it puts the point simply. Eridu mattered because it stood at the meeting point of deep archaeology and deep memory, a city where temples were rebuilt over millennia and where later texts still remembered the first kingship after it descended from heaven. The electronic text corpus gives us the textual side. The excavation reports give us the architectural side. Together they anchor the claim in the documented mainstream. Even the stories that seem most mythic are preserved in sober scholarly apparatus. The Electronic Babylonian Library describes Adapa as the first antediluvian sage who brought civilization to mankind and then ascended to heaven. The flood text states that after the powers of kingship descended from heaven, the cities were allotted and the rites perfected. Berossus, writing in the Hellenistic period but drawing on Mesopotamian traditions, says Oannes emerged from the sea and taught humanity writing, laws, city building, agriculture, and the arts of civilized life. These are not identical texts. They are not even from the same period, but they preserve a structurally stable idea. Ordered human life is not self-generated. It is delivered. The difficulty is not absence of data. It is what we choose not to do with it. The anomaly begins, for me, with a small act of intellectual sorting. Scholars rightly dismiss the old popular claim that one Akkadian cylinder seal, VA243 in Berlin, is a literal map of the solar system. Michael Heiser's analysis, drawing on Anton Mortgat's 1940 publication, showed why that specific reading fails. The inscription is ordinary. The central emblem is not the Mesopotamian sign for the sun, but a star-like symbol. The surrounding circles need not be planets. On those points, the corrective is sound. I have no interest in rescuing a bad translation or pretending every cluster of dots is advanced astronomy. But once that necessary debunking is done, something curious happens. Inquiry stops. The seal becomes unusable. It is placed in a mental quarantine, as though refuting one exaggerated claim exhausts the object's significance. I want to stay with that for a moment. A real Akkadian cylinder seal in Berlin, catalogued as VA243, published by Anton Mortgat, shows a presentation scene beneath an unusual celestial cluster that later readers found compelling enough to fight over for decades. Yet mainstream discussion of the object in public culture now seems devoted almost entirely to telling us what it is not. That is a very strange fate for an artifact. The mainstream explanation is that VA243 is a conventional presentation seal. A worshipper, a mediating figure, a superior figure, and astral symbols rendered in the flexible graphic language of Mesopotamian glyptic. That may well be correct. Cylinder seals often compress theology, hierarchy, and symbolism into tiny spaces, but conventional does not close the question, because what counts as conventional in Akkadian Mesopotamia is already extraordinary. A conventional seal from this world can still depict human beings being presented into a divine order framed by star signs, that while contemporary texts insist that kingship descended from heaven and sages brought civilization before the flood. The official explanation tells me the object belongs to a known category. It does not tell me why the category itself is so saturated with vertical transfer, celestial authorization, and memory of instruction from beyond the human sphere. I keep coming back to that. As I discussed before when looking at origin myths that later harden into institutions, the interesting question is not whether the ancients used symbolic language. It is why this specific symbolic language sits so close to their administrative, ritual, and political foundations. Before moving forward, this deserves attention. The Sumerian flood text does not merely say cities existed, it says that after kingship, crown, and throne had descended from heaven, the divine rights and the exalted powers were perfected, and the first cities were assigned to specific gods. In other words, rule, ritual, and urban order arrive as a package that is not a modern projection. It is what the text says, and when that package keeps resurfacing in imagery, I do not think it is methodologically responsible to shrug and call the matter settled. The first layer of evidence is textual and blunt. The king list says kingship descended from heaven and first resided in Eridug. The flood text adds crown, throne, rights, and exalted powers. Berossus says Oannes taught writing, city planning, laws, and agriculture. The EBL calls Adapa the first sage who brought civilization to mankind and ascended to heaven. Separate compositions, separate transmission histories, the same direction of travel. They're downward into human order. Why is the earliest memory of civilization framed as receipt rather than invention? The second layer is iconographic. The Ada seal in the British Museum, Museum number 89115, dated to around 2300 BC and likely from Sippar, shows an entire theological assembly compressed into greenstone only 3.90 centimeters high and 2.55 centimeters in diameter. Ishtar stands winged and armed on a mountain. Shamash rises between mountains holding his serrated blade. Ea stands with 1 foot on the mountain, streams of water and fish pouring from his shoulders, while behind him waits the two-faced Usimu. The owner's inscription is simple: Ada, scribe. That is what strikes me. The text is ordinary, the image is not. A working professional carries on his person a rolled cosmos in which deities emerge, mediate, arm, air, and authorize. The Smithsonian's discussion of Mesopotamian seal inscriptions notes that the relationship between inscription and image is often unclear. Exactly. The bureaucracy is plain, the cosmology is dense. Why were everyday acts of authentication wrapped in scenes this elevated? Then there is the focal object. VA243 is small enough to disappear into a closed hand. It is a drilled cylinder of dark stone from the Akkadian world, now known mostly through its published impression, catalogued in the Berlin Vorderasiatisches Museum, and made famous, then infamous, by later argument. On the impression, a seated superior figure faces a standing figure who appears to be led or introduced by another. Above and between them hangs that stubborn celestial cluster, a larger star-like emblem with smaller round bodies arranged nearby. So the inscription, as published by Mortgat and discussed by Heiser, names Dubsiga and Ili Ilat, and gives the ordinary phrase, your servant. That banality matters. The seal is not screaming at secret, it whispers through convention. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. What unsettles me is not that it obviously depicts planets. It does not. What unsettles me is the entire composition, submission, mediation, rank and sky sign, compressed into a bureaucratic tool that once rolled across wet clay. A human hand held this. A human wrist may have worn it. It authenticated transactions while carrying a tiny vertical drama of access and power. What was this for? The third layer comes from the Apkallu tradition. Later Mesopotamian ritual texts remember 7 sages associated with primordial knowledge. The scholarship on Bitmeseri preserves the description of Wana as the figure who completed the plans of heaven and earth. That formulation is not casual. Plans of heaven and earth. Not village custom, not tribal memory, cosmic schematics. In the Neo-Assyrian period, this conceptual world becomes material in apotropaic objects. The Met's clay bird-headed Apkallu, object 54.117.26, only 14.2 centimeters tall, was buried beneath the floor of a room at Nimrud as ritual protection. The figure holds a bucket. Monumental reliefs show related beings carrying bucket and cone beside sacred trees. The Brooklyn Museum explains these wall figures as spirits sprinkling water in royal spaces. I want to sit with that before moving on. The same civilization that remembers antediluvian sages, bringing ordered Nol, also buries miniature hybrid guardians beneath thresholds and lines, palace walls with winged beings handling purificatory instruments. Is this merely religion in the generic sense? Or is it the residue of a much more specific theory of how order enters the world? The fourth layer is contextual, and it matters more than the internet arguments ever acknowledge. Eridu's mythology, Enki's temple sequence, the transfer of the Me in the Anadna traditions, the king list's first city, the flood survivor receiving life, Adapa ascending to heaven, the Apkallu guarding palaces, the presentation seal beneath celestial symbols. None of these by itself rewrites human history. Together they do something more difficult. They establish that the earliest literate civilization consistently encoded a vertical model of civilization. Order descends, kingship descends, rights descend, plans descend, instruction descends. The seal in Berlin is not powerful because it proves a modern theory. It is powerful because it belongs to this larger vocabulary and cannot honestly be isolated from it. Why are we so determined to isolate it? When I pull back, the pattern does not stay in Mesopotamia. Egypt offers the first broadening. The pyramid texts, the oldest large corpus of religious writing from ancient Egypt, preserve the king's transformation in explicitly celestial terms, but one detail is especially hard to ignore. In James P. Allen's translation of the mouth-opening ritual, the officiant says, "Let me part your mouth for you," and uses divine metal. I'd often understood as meteoritic iron, the substance later Egyptians associated with iron from the sky. This is not a random material choice. Royal animation is achieved through a substance imagined as non-terrestrial, a medium literally linked to heaven. Set beside the Palermo stone and other king lists that place divine or semi-divine rule before human dynasties, the structure becomes familiar. Political and ritual order is not simply human bricolage. It is passed downward through sanctioned contact between the sky world and the ruler. China gives the same logic in a different grammar. By the Zhou period, the phrase mandate of heaven is already doing heavy ideological work. Heaven confers legitimacy, withdraws it, and judges dynasties. That sounds abstract until you place it beside specific objects. Thus the Heizun bronze inscription from the early Western Zhou is one of the earliest material witnesses to this political cosmology, explicitly grounding royal authority in a heavenly charge. Later texts in the Book of Documents repeat the same structure. Rule is not self-authorized. It is vertically bestowed and vertically revoked. Different language, different script, different ritual system, no documented line of transmission from Sumerian antiquity, yet the same organizing principle appears. Authority is imagined as descending from above into a chosen human order. Mesoamerica does it again. At Palenque, the 7th century sarcophagus lid of Kinich Janab Pakal places the king in direct relation to the world tree, the vertical axis connecting underworld, earth and heavens. The Smarth History's summary is concise. Pakal occupies an intermediary space between heaven above and Xibalba below. That is not a loose resemblance. It is a formal statement that rulership and cosmology meet on a vertical corridor. The Popol Vuh, in a wholly different Mesoamerican context, names the creative authority itself heart of sky, and civilization is repeatedly treated as something shaped through intervention from powers above the human plane. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? I do not think that question can be answered away with the word archetype and a tired shrug. Human beings do create recurring symbols. Of course they do. Sky, mountain, ladder, tree, throne, descent, sanction, instruction. These are old images because they speak to common experience. But when the same architecture of meaning recurs not just as mythic scenery, but as the logic of kingship, ritual technology, civilizing as an instruction, and elite self-representation, I slow down. Before moving on, this deserves attention. The issue is not whether ancient cultures looked upward. Every culture did. The issue is why so many foundational civilizations describe the beginning of ordered life not as discovery from below, but as a transmission from above, and then materialize that claim in named objects, named texts, and formal institutions. And there is a fourth case that sharpens the edge. In the Andes, chroniclers of Inca tradition record that Manco Capac and Mama Oclilo were sent by the sun to organize humanity, carrying the golden staff that would identify the place of rightful settlement. I am aware of the problems here. The accounts are post-conquest, they are filtered through colonial transcription, but structurally the pattern is unmistakable. Legitimacy, urban founding, and civil order descend through emissaries of the sky. That is the same operating logic we saw in Mesopotamia with Oannes and Adapa, in China with Heaven's Mandate, and in Egypt with kingly animation through heavenly substance. Different continents, different ecologies, no documented contact, a repeating grammar of civilization. This is where I start hearing the institutional objection, and some of it is fair. I want to slow this down once more, because the broad pattern is easy to blur if it is spoken too quickly. In Mesopotamia, the object is a cylinder seal, and the text is a king list. In Egypt, the object is Yad's ritual implement working with sky metal, and the text is the pyramid corpus. In China, the object is an inscribed bronze, and the text is the mandate tradition. In Maya Mesoamerica, the object is a limestone sarcophagus lid, and the text is the Popol Vuh's theology of heart of sky. In the Andes, the object is the golden staff of the origin narrative, and the text is the remembered charge of the sun's children. The surfaces change, the scripts change, the empires rise and fall, but the structure holds. Human order is validated by contact with a higher realm, and then fixed in material form. That is why I find the Berlin Seal difficult to dismiss as an isolated curiosity. It is not alone in world history. It belongs to one of history's oldest and most persistent ways of remembering beginnings. That Mesopotamia has been damaged by imperial collecting, war, sanctions, looting, underfunding, and the sheer difficulty of preserving mud brick landscapes across modern political catastrophe. The Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf Wars, the 2003 invasion, the looting wave that followed, and the destruction of heritage sites by Daesh all shattered continuity of research. The British Museum's Iraq scheme, backed by £2.9 million in UK government support and launched after 2015, trained Iraqi staff in rescue archaeology. That is real work, necessary work. No serious person should talk about neglect in Iraq without naming the violence that made sustained archaeology extraordinarily hard. But those reasons are not sufficient. They explain interruption. They do not explain the shallowness of the questions we ask once material is available. The British Museum says plainly that Girsu, one of the great Sumerian sites, had been left open and exposed for more than 80 years, scarred by 19th and early 20th century excavations that stripped objects from context. More than 80 years. When Newark finally recovered tablets in situ from the Akkadian Archive building, the result was immediately transformative because context had been missing all along. The same page notes that Major finds from Girsu are now dispersed in museums around the world, often detached from the layers, rooms, and institutional settings that once gave them full meaning. That is not coordinated suppression. It is something more mundane, and to me more alarming. A long habit of accepting decontextualization as an unfortunate normal. Eridu tells a similar story. Here, Marco Ramazzotti's 2015 overview of the Iraqi-Italian mission states that the last archaeological campaigns at Eridu took place 65 years earlier in 1946 to 1949, and that the site and surrounding area had not been systematically investigated for more than 50 years. National Geographic's recent history confirms the stop-and-start rhythm. Early visits in the 19th century, short campaigns in 1918 and 1919, major work beginning in 1946, publication in 1981, and only later attempts to resume. That is not a mystery born of missing evidence, it is a timeline of interrupted attention. If the place named first in the Sumerian memory of kingship can sit that long between serious campaigns, what exactly do we mean when we say the field has adequately processed the implications of its own cess? There is a wider textual version of the same failure. Depending on whose estimate one uses, hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets survive, and only a fraction have been read, published, or meaningfully integrated into larger historical arguments. Even where the raw number is debated, the scale gap is not. Meanwhile, public discussion of Mesopotamian anomalies is left to a grotesque choice between sensational overreach and dismissive correction. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that and in some ways more troubling. A civilization can be exhaustively catalogued and still insufficiently questioned. An object can be famous and still unread in the deeper sense. A seal can be debunked and thereby made almost untouchable, not because its context is understood, but because the cultural penalty for reopening the file feels too high. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying VA243 is a map of the solar system. I am not saying Mesopotamian texts prove non-human visitors intervened in prehistory. I am not claiming that recurring sky descent language across continents demonstrates direct contact between those civilizations. What I am saying is simpler, and I do not think it can be responsibly dismissed. The mainstream record shows that the earliest literate civilization repeatedly described kingship, ritual order, and civilizing knowledge as descending from heaven, materialized that claim in seals, temple traditions, and banned protective figurines, and preserved related memories from Eridu to the Apkallu corpus over many centuries. That observation is not speculative, it is the documented pattern. So once you accept that pattern, the Berlin Seal stops being a novelty object and starts looking like one compact witness inside a much larger archive of vertical memory. So the questions begin to accumulate, and I do not think they are eccentric questions. Why does the Sumerian record place the origin of kingship in descent from heaven rather than in conquest, kinship, or agriculture, when those were all available human explanations? What exactly was being remembered when Adapa was called the first sage who brought civilization to mankind and then ascended to heaven? The record does not tell us why a simple professional seal like VA243 needed its act of human submission staged beneath a peculiar celestial cluster, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Which parts are convention and which parts are residue? Why do the Apkallu traditions speak of completing the plans of heaven and earth if the intended meaning is merely generic wisdom? What was an Akkadian viewer meant to see, immediately and without commentary, in the cluster above VA243? And the Adda seal raises its own precise problem. Why does a scribe named Adda carry on his body a portable scene of divine emergence, cosmic landscape, and multi-god presence for everyday acts of authentication? I have another question that is quieter, but it may be the one that bothers me most. If the public-facing scholarly answer to these things is that they are normal within their symbolic world, then what do we do when the symbolic world itself appears to encode a sustained memory that civilization was bestowed, not invented? That is not a rhetorical flourish, it is a methodological problem. But we have become so accustomed to translating ancient statements about descent into the neutral language of ideology that we no longer ask whether ideology might itself be the formal shell of a much older and more specific inheritance. I'm not asking for wild conclusions, I'm asking whether the archive is being read at the level of seriousness its own repetition deserves. There is also the problem of material hierarchy. Seals were not public monuments, they were intimate devices, held, worn, rolled, pressed. If cosmic authorization appears on palace walls, that is one thing. If it appears in the private instrument of validation, that is another. Small object, large claim. Why? And if Gersu's archives, Eridu's temple sequence, the king list, the flood texts, Adapa, Oannes, the Apkallu figures, and the glyptic evidence all lean in the same direction, at what point does caution stop being prudence and become a refusal of synthesis? Another absence nags at me. When later Mesopotamian scholars preserved these traditions, they did not annotate them for us in the way modern readers want. They transmitted them. They copied them. They embedded them in ritual series, king lists, and learned literature. That suggests continuity. But continuity of what? Belief, memory, prestige, or inherited formula? I cannot say. Yet I also cannot ignore that ancient scribes who were perfectly capable of mundane bookkeeping kept returning in their most serious accounts of beginnings to descent, instruction, and celestial sanction. A metaphor can survive for millennia, so can a distorted recollection. The archive permits both possibilities. But what it does not permit, at least not honestly, is the lazy assumption that the language is empty simply because it is old. We do not know what the earliest Mesopotamians believed they were preserving. Glass cases have a particular silence. In reproduction, VA243 looks argumentative because people have argued over it for so long. In reality, or as close to reality as the published impression allows, it looks patient. The scene does not strain to persuade. A seated authority receives. A standing human approaches under mediation. Above them, the star-like emblem and smaller bodies hover without explanation, neither diagram nor ornament in any trivial sense, just present, like part of the grammar. I find myself thinking about the hand that cut it, the owner who used it, the wet clay that once took its impression, as the archive or jar or docket it once sealed, and the fact that such a small thing could carry such a stable worldview without ever explaining itself. Then I think about the other objects that refuse to stay in their lanes. The Adda seal with its mountain dawn and assembled gods, the little Apkallu from Nimrud, buried under a floor where no spectator was meant to admire it. The temple levels at Eridu, rising one above another, like memory hardening into architecture. The Akkadian tablets at Gersu lying in rooms until context finally returned. I am not trying to flatten these things into a single theory. I am trying to honour a discomfort that the archive itself produces when read continuously instead of piecemeal. The discomfort is not that the ancients were mysterious, it is that they were consistent, and consistency is dangerous. And not because it proves an extravagant thesis, but because it denies us the comfort of treating each case as local, decorative, or merely mythopoetic. At some point the repetition becomes part of the evidence. Kingship from heaven, rights from heaven, plans of heaven and earth, civilization brought to mankind, objects that miniaturize the transaction, ritual substances tied to the sky, authority framed as descent. I am left, after months with these texts and images, not with certainty, but with a narrowing corridor of plausible indifference. The official silence is not total. The literature exists, the catalogues exist, the translations exist. What is missing is not information, it is appetite. The final image for me is still that seal in Berlin, the one so many people have used badly that others now seem afraid to use it at all, and a dark cylinder, drilled through its axis, turned in the fingers of a person dead for 4,000 years, its impression showing a human being brought before superiority under a compact sky of signs. Its inscription so ordinary it almost mocks our hunger for revelation. It has survived empire, excavation, cataloguing, overinterpretation, rebuttal and neglect. It still sits there, withholding just enough to remain dangerous, asking whether the first civilizations were remembering something we have been too disciplined to hear. If a civilization begins by insisting authority fell from the sky, the unanswered question is not why they imagined it, but what they remembered.